Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining me on my talk about the history of trolls and also how did trolls come to be such an enduring symbol of Norway. And, like everything, it starts with a story. And in this case, it starts with the story of creation, the one that was told, well, by the Vikings and by the people who lived before the Vikings, before there were any written records, but we still have records of it in metalwork and engraved in stones and places like that. And so, according to these sources, and according to Snorre, and I'll get back to some of those later, when the world began, in the beginning there was nothing at all, except in the north there was a vast sort of a frozen, foggy area called Niflheim. And then in the south, there was an area of fire, and that was called Muspelheim. And then in the middle was a huge gap, and that was called Ginnunga Gap. And that's all that there was for eons upon eons. And then one day, a spark from Muspelheim fell into the ice, and it formed life. And out of this huge out of this ice and the gap came a giant, a huge frost giant whose name was Ymir. So the very first thing in the entire world when it began, according to Norse mythology, was a giant. And up next to the giant came a huge, enormous cow. And the giant Ymir fed on the milk from the cow. And he got bigger and bigger and bigger. He got just enormous. And the cow fed itself by licking on the rime and the frost at the edge of the gap. Well, Ymir ate so much and got so big that after a certain number of eons, I don't even know how many, he fell asleep. And while he slept, from out of his left armpit grew a Jotun man and a Jotun woman. And the Jotuns, Jotun, we say in Norwegian, the Jotuns were the first kinds of trolls that came into existence. They were huge and they were uncouth, but these were fairly clever. After the Jotun had been given birth to from his left armpit, then from between that giant Ymir's toes came the race of the trolls. Some had 5, 6 heads, some had 1 head, some had 3, 9, 12. They were all big, huge, burly, ugly, nasty creatures, and they just started multiplying and running all over the place. But the cow had also created life. And so out of the rime came this beautiful creature that was tall and straight and intelligent. And this creature married one of the Jotun maidens. It is an odd thing about Jotuns, but once in a while, despite the fact that they're big and ugly and nothing to dream about, they occasionally have beautiful, kind-hearted daughters. And it was one of these that married this beautiful creature that the cow had created. And together they had 3 sons, and these sons became the first gods, and Odin was one of them. Now, these gods were magnificent. They were beautiful. They were tall, and they had the power to create. They could create a world, and that's what they set about doing. But they had to first get rid of these terrible Jotuns and the trolls, and they set about slaying them one after another. And they got rid of most of them, but a few of them escaped and fled to the west into Jotunheimen, the home of the Jotun trolls, which is still in Norway to this very day. You should go. And then once they had gotten rid of almost all the trolls and Jotuns, then they killed Ymir. And they took Ymir and they took his body, and from his flesh, they created all the soil. And then from his blood, they created the oceans and the rivers and the lakes. And then his bones became the mountains, and his teeth became the rocks and the boulders all around. And his hair and his beard became the grass and the shrubs and the trees. And then what they did is they took his skull and they set it up and they created the vault of the sky. And they took his brains and they used that for clouds. Then they pushed the rest of his body into the gap. But by this time, maggots had begun to form, and these turned into the gnomes, the dwarves, the elves, and all of the people that later became known as the hidden folk, the underjordiske in Norway. And then there was a few sparks that they took from Nordspelheim, and they threw those up into the sky, and they became the sun and the moon and all the stars. So you have to realize that before anything else was created, the first thing in the world was a huge troll. I mean, it was basically a giant troll. And when you walk around in Norway, you're walking on dead troll parts. So the history of troll begins, with the very, very beginning. And this stories and a rich sort of mythology of stories like this one, I should say that, the gods then went about creating what they call the 9 worlds, and they put into it all the animals and, everything that's there. And then the last thing then they created was a man and a woman, and then created a man from an ash tree and a woman from an alder tree. And so they set them to rule over Midgard. But right from the very beginning in this story, the trolls that had survived had already multiplied and had the Jotuns. They were so angry with the gods and hated the gods and set upon destroying everything that the gods had created, especially the gods' favorite creation, which was the male and the female, the humans, who they had set to rule over Midgard. And so the beginning of all the stories is the beginning of that opposition between trolls and the gods and humans. But initially, it's the trolls are only fighting the gods. They're not fighting the humans. And the main protector of all of the gods, of all of the humans, was the god named Thor. Thor was the son of Odin and a Jotun maiden too. And, the Jotuns was uncommonly strong. And so it's possible that it is from his mother that Thor got his enormous strength. But in any event, the Viking era, when these stories were told from 700 to 1050 roughly, had this rich mythological tradition, and people had this religion where they worshipped these basically nature gods, Thor and Odin and Frigg and Freya. We're not going to go into any of that, but it's important to understand the history of trolls. It's always a story of the trolls in the beginning, trolls in opposition to the gods, and intent on destroying the world that the gods had created, because the gods had destroyed most of their people and their father Ymir, the frost giant. So Thor became the favorite god of all of the Vikings, because Thor was the one who really and truly protected them from the nasty trolls. Thor, with his enormous strength, could make himself even stronger because he had a special belt. And when he tightened that belt, he doubled his strength. Best of all, he had his hammer, Mjolnir, which was such that when he threw it, it would hit whatever he threw it at, which was usually a troll. And then he would crush its skull, and it would be just giant boom when you heard that. And then the Mjolnir would come back to his hand. Mjolnir could also be made tiny so that he could wear it as an amulet around his neck. He was so important that, and the way he protected humans, a lot of people in those days would wear a Thor's hammer around their neck, and they would carve Thor's hammer or Thor's likeness into the posts of their houses for good luck. Thor rode around in the sky in a wagon that was pulled by 2 billy goats, Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder. And when he rode up across the sky, those billy goats kicked up so much dust that it looked like huge thunderclouds down on earth. And the billy goats would gnash their teeth so they would be sparks flying, and it would look like lightning. And when he hit his hammer at something, that giant boom would tell people on earth that Thor had hit his target and they were safe from trolls. So whenever there was a huge lightning and thunderstorm, usually people were grateful not only did they get rain to, help with their crops, but it also meant that Thor had saved them once again from some nasty troll. So when I was a little girl growing up in Norway, every time there was a thunderstorm, we would go, yay, there is Thor protecting us, even though, of course, we didn't believe it in the way that people did those back in those days. So anyway, there was this rich mythological world of stories and storytelling. There was some writing; people wrote the runes, but they didn't write down long stories that way. Just there was a lot of imagery and the shortened versions of it. And then what happened was that in 1050, Christianity arrived in Norway. It first came to Sweden and to Denmark and to Iceland, and all of those countries took to Christianity fairly readily. And in Norway, not so much. It was done at the point of a sword. But, eventually they converted. And with that conversion, things changed for the old stories. The priests, this was, of course, Catholicism. The Reformation comes about 500 years later. But the priests did not allow these stories, and they did not allow the old rituals that were practiced. They did allow the imagery, which is really interesting because if you go to the earliest churches that were built, the stave churches, which were built around 1200, and even 1300, you can go inside and you can see that in some of them there are images of Thor and Odin, and you see, the dragons and imagery from the stories that were told back in the Viking era. And that did not go away. They didn't have to remove that. And even though they weren't allowed to tell the stories, of course, you can't keep a good story down. They just change format a little bit, just as the rituals were changed format and maybe changed names. So the stories were actually, a lot of them, and the myths were written down around 1200 in Iceland by Snorri Sturlason, who wrote the Icelandic, sagas, and also down, including all of the myths and stories. And what's unique about Snorri is that he wrote everything in his native language, which is the same as what Norwegians spoke, and Danes and Swedes, Old Norse. This is completely unique in all of Europe. Everything else that was written in those days was written in Latin or in Greek. In fact, in Denmark, there was he was a historian and a scholar named Saxo. I don't know how to say it in English, Saxo Grammaticus. And he wrote a history of the Danes, and where you get a lot of the same stories that Snorri is relating, but he wrote everything in Latin. So one of the things that makes the Norse myths, the Norse sagas so unique, and perhaps why literacy has become such an important thing in all of these countries, is that their very, very first literature was actually recorded in their own native language. It's something that's very special. Some people say, but this was written down 150 years after, 200 years, after they were, told, when you tell things, don't things change a lot? How can we know that this is what it was like? And of course, you can't, but we do observe in cultures where they do have a rich oral tradition and have had it, that it's actually very, very reliable. If the way that you rely on passing on information is exclusively oral, then that's the muscle that you really work with in your mind, and it becomes a very reliable thing. Snorri was Christian, so it's probable that it colored his point of view a bit when he wrote things down, but still, it's probably quite reliable. So one of the first changes that happened here, once these stories got, the old myths were forbidden, and what happened is that now the trolls weren't forbidden. stories about trolls and Jotuns. It was just the gods. You couldn't have Thor, you couldn't have Odin, you couldn't have any of those guys in there. And so now in the stories, the trolls become in opposition to humans. Now, what are trolls like? They were still huge giants, right? They're uncouth, they're ugly, they're nasty. They have 3, 6, 9, sometimes even 12 heads. Their brains on the trolls are not really very big. They're not super smart. It's a lot of, rolling around up there. So they don't think very quickly. Jotuns, on the other hand, were always a lot more clever. They were just as big and just as ugly. They had heads that were made out of stone and feet that were made out of ice. But the thing about them was, unlike trolls, they could be outside when the sun was shining. Now, trolls could not be outside when the sun was shining. If the sun were to shine directly at a troll, he would burst and he would turn into thousands and thousands of rocks and scatter all over the landscape. And if you go to Norway, you'll see evidence of this, right? I mean, there are piles of rocks, and there's stories about how that rock there was thrown by a troll who didn't like the sound of the church bells, or entire mountain ranges that are named after the trolls that they once were, but they turned to rock because they were outside when the sun came up. So they became more creatures of darkness than they had been before. In the myths, they could be out in the daytime. So could the Jotuns. But now the stories are less and less about the Jotuns. They were maybe too clever, because now it's in opposition to humans. So the humans are the ones that have to really figure out how to outsmart the trolls, how to outwit them, how to fight them. And so trolls became sort of creatures. The sun, is on the side of humans. We're creatures who can live in the light of day, and they could not. Well, they can live on a cloudy day like today, but at least here in Duluth, where I live, it's a good day to be a troll outside. But they live inside mountains. They live in the deep shadows where the forest is so dense that no sunshine can reach it. Because if they were to come out, they would burst. And if you go to Norway, you will find mountain ranges. Last summer, I went to Trolltindene, the Troll Peaks, Trollhetta, the Troll Hat. I drove up something called Trollstigen, the Troll's Ladder, in the mountains there. And there are, every local area has stories about how that, that was a troll caught, in there. The Troll Tongue is a very famous one, the Troll Wall. And so the whole landscape, they became very much of the landscape. Now, let's see. There was one thing that's really interesting that happened, and that is that in the old myths, when the elves came crawling out, the maggots were turned into elves, the gods actually decided to give the elves reason, the ability to reason. And they created a separate world for the elves, Alfheim. So the elves often feel like they're more creatures of light, they're more rational than the gnomes and the dwarves, who are still thought of back then as creatures of the dark, creatures of that kind of in-between world, the dusk and the dawn, when they come out and cause some havoc. And so humans often had quite an ambivalent relationship. They no ambivalence with the trolls, but when it came to the elves and gnomes and dwarves, there was a feeling that, they're other, but they're not so other that they're not also quite like us. There's this sort of a sense of kinship, and there's some beautiful stories about that. We'll see if I will have time to tell any of those. There is one that I think is, that's very telling. There's a story that said that when Adam and Eve were first kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they went, to live in the East, and they had a lot of children, and Eve just was not a very good housekeeper. There were so many children, and there was so much to do, and she just didn't seem to be able to do everything she needed to do every day to keep, her house clean and tidy, and the kids all, looking good. And then one day, much to her surprise, Lord God showed up, and he said, well, Eve, I've come to see your children. And she was so embarrassed because she had only managed to clean and wash two of them and dress two of them. And the rest of them were running around, inside like a bunch of little ragamuffins. And so in her embarrassment, she took the two clean and tidy ones and she brought them out and she said, here, Lord, these are my children. But of course, God sees and knows everything. And he said, oh, Eve, what you have shown these children of yours and their descendants, from now on, they will always be able to live in the light. But those that you have hidden shall forever remain hidden. And so it's been, the hidden folk are really our siblings, our hidden selves. So there's just a real sort of ambivalent feeling about those creatures. And also much more of a sense, like even today, like, I know those stories are real, Anyway, back to the history. What happened in 1349, it's a long time ago, is the Black Death. And the Black Death was just devastating in Scandinavia. It halved the population, perhaps in places more than 60%. Of the population died. And what was especially bad among the educated classes, so bad that in 1380, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark went together and formed a union. There was actually not enough people to run the countries as independent countries, which they had been up until this point. In fact, Norway had been perhaps the most powerful of the three, but they went into that union and with the thought that Norway would become the more powerful one. And that is not what came to pass, partially thanks to a very clever Danish queen. Never underestimate the Danish queen. Anyway, this Kalmar Union was to just so that these countries could be governed. And Sweden got back on its feet and left the Union in 1523, but Norway stayed and remained at this point sort of a minor part of Denmark. It's a much, much, much bigger country, but it was very, very poor and kind of got absorbed into Denmark, along with what was then our territories. You might not know this, but Iceland and Greenland and the Faroe Islands all were Norwegian territory. And when Norway joined this union with Denmark, those also came into that union. So anyway, Sweden leaves and Norway stays. And Norway stays in this until 1814. During these times, every education has to be done in Danish. If you wanted to get educated, you went to Denmark and you learned and you spoke Danish. Every book that was published in Norway was published in Danish. Things that were taught in school were taught in Danish. We were Danish. And most people, of course, were illiterate, 80-90% of the population being peasants, and they didn't really read, but they told stories. They kept on telling the stories. For the educated, Snorri's collections of Norse sagas and mythologies became a very important part for them as a Norwegian identity, separate from that of Denmark. And I think for the peasants, it was the stories. You're telling the stories. And again, the trolls over time, they're still terrifying. There's none of that small, cute thing that you often see now. And for sure, not like in the troll movie with those cute ones. Those are Danish trolls, not Norwegian trolls. We're talking Norwegian trolls there. But that there is a new hero that emerges. In the old days, the hero was Thor in opposition to the trolls. Now the hero is Espen Ashlad. And there's a lot of scholars that think that, Thor became Espen Ashlad. Thor was kind of he's a big, strong god with the red hair and a red beard and mustache. And, but he wasn't the brightest bulb. He made a lot of mistakes. And he was good-natured, though, and good-hearted. And he always defended humans to the bitter end. He would do anything. And he always won against the trolls, even if it would take several attempts. And now it's the Ashlad. The Ashlad is always the youngest of three brothers. He appears to be not very clever. He appears to just being only good for sitting around and poking in the ashes. That's why he's got that name, the Ashlad. In some translations, you see him called the Cinder Lad. In some actually use the expression boots. I'm not sure why. It might be because in one story, he gets a pair of boots that are very remarkable. They're such that when you put them on, you can take at one step is 7 miles. So it's possible. It's an English translator who went with that back in the 1800s. The trolls, it changed a little. And I thought I would tell you a troll story so that you could get a sense of what the trolls probably were like. And you might know this story. It's called the Ashlad. I wanted to tell an Ashlad story. The Ashlad who had an eating competition with a troll. So once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a father and a mother who had 3 sons, and they had a farm. And on this farm, there was this huge forest. And the father was able to go into the woods and he could fell down trees and he would build furniture and he would help, sell it for lumber. He made a good living until one day he was out in the woods and he was chopping away and he threw out his back. It was terrible. He had to go to bed. He couldn't move. It hurt so badly. And it just didn't get any better. Weeks went by and he still was unable to get up. And, they ran out of money. So he had 3 almost grown sons, and he decided it was about time that they went out and started to help out. So he told them it was about time they went into the woods and they do some chopping. And the boys were like, "No, Dad, why? I'm sure you'll be up on your feet in no time. We don't want to go into the woods. There are trolls out there," said the father. "Trolls? How can you be afraid of trolls? When I was your age, I knew how to trick trolls." Well, the boys just did not like the idea, but the father kept on pestering them. So finally, they agreed to his way of thinking. So the first one to go out was the oldest. His name was Pan. He was kind of pretty big kid for his age. He rolled up his sleeves. He grabbed an axe and he went off into the woods. After a while, he came to this spot where there was some great big, huge trees. And he got his axe and he started to get ready to chop. Oh, he had no sooner struck the first blow than out of the woods comes this great big huge troll screaming and roaring at him. "If you cut out my woods, I'm going to kill you and eat you up." Well, the boy got so terrified, he just flung his axe aside, he took to his heels, and he ran home as fast as he could. And when he got home, he just was out of breath. "Oh, Mom, Dad, you don't know how lucky you are that I'm still alive. Huge troll, everyone." The father just scoffed. He goes, "What? You run away from a troll? I mean, when I was your age, I dealt with those creatures all the time. They can be tricked. You know that." Oh, he said, "You're nothing but a coward." Wasn't much the boy could say to that. So he went over to the corner and he sat down. So the next to go up was the second brother. He was a big, strong kid too. Peter was his name. He rolled up his sleeves, walked off into the woods, got out his axe, and started to get ready to chop. Oh, he had no sooner struck the first blow than again, out of the woods comes this great big huge troll screaming and roaring. "If you're cutting down my woods, I'm going to kill you and eat you." And the boy just took one look at this huge troll and he flung his axe aside, ran home crying, "Mom, Dad, Mom, Dad, there's a troll out there and he wants to kill me." But again, the father just looked at him and said, "What? You're afraid of a troll? I can't believe it. When I was your age, I dealt with them all the time. And what do? You just run home like a chicken." Well, wasn't much the boy could say, so he went over to his brother and sat down. Well, the next one to go out was the youngest. His name was Ashlad because he liked to sit around and poke in the ashes. When the brothers heard that he was going to go, they just started laughing, going, "You think you're going to be able to go and deal with a troll when we haven't been able to? Come on, don't be ridiculous." But, he was used to being teased. He just didn't pay any attention. He just went to his mother, and he asked for some food. Well, they were pretty poor by now. And so she didn't have much, but she had this one big cheese curd about this size, big white cheese curd. So he took the cheese curd and he put it in his backpack, put his backpack on, grabbed another axe and went off into the woods. When he came to that same place with those big, beautiful trees, he put his axe down, got his backpack off and put it down to the side and got ready to chop. Oh, he had no sooner struck the first blow than again out of the woods comes this great big huge troll screaming and roaring at him. If you cut down my woods, I'm going to kill you and eat you. But this boy, he was not so slow. He ran over to his backpack, fished out the cheese, held it up and said, if you don't watch it, I'm going to squeeze you the way I'm squeezing water out of this rock I have here. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were so strong. Please don't squeeze me. Listen, if you promise not to do that, I'll help you chop down the woods. All right, that was good, said the Ashlad. And so that's what they did. And that troll was so clever at chopping down that in no time at all, they had just cleared the entire space and it was just piled with cords and cords of wood. Well, the troll was getting really hungry and he was looking at that juicy boy and he said, how about it? Why don't you come to my place and we'll have a bite to eat together? Well, the Ashlad was hungry. And so he said, sure, I'll come. And so off they went. And he walked and walked and walked until they came to the mountain in the blue where the troll lived. And the troll went inside and he said, I'm going to make up some fire in the fireplace. And then why don't you go outside and you get the buckets and fill them with water and bring them back in here. And then we're going to make some porridge. Okay, said the Ashlad. And he went outside. But when he got to the well, the buckets were huge. They were made of cast iron. They were so heavy, he couldn't even budge them when he threw his body at them. So he had to think quickly because the troll thought he was so strong. Suddenly he had an idea and he shouted, you know what? I'm not gonna bother with these two small buckets that you have out here. I'm gonna go and bring in the entire well. The troll was like, no, stop it. I can't afford to lose my water. Just drop everything, come in here and you make up the fire and I will go and get the water. Suit yourself, said the Ashlad. And so that's what they did. And when the troll had made up all of the porridge, he put it onto the table and they were getting ready to eat. And he gave this hungry look at the Ashlad and he said, how about it? Should we start eating? And he was thinking about how he was going to have, some Ashlad pretty soon. And the Ashlad saw the look in his face and he said, how about you and I have an eating competition? Oh, that's a good idea, said the troll. Oh, let's do it. And so he sat down and got ready. But before he sat down, the Ashlad got out his backpack and he opened it up and he put it around his stomach. And then he got his spoon and he started to eat. And he ate and he ate and he ate. And after a while, instead of putting the food in his mouth, he put it in his backpack. And when his backpack was full, he got out his knife and he put it to his backpack and he ripped a hole in it. And then he kept on eating and filling it. Well, the troll was looking at him, but he couldn't figure out what was going on. So he just kept on eating and finally put his spoon down. He said, I can't fit another bite in. Oh, come on, said the Ashlad. Big guy like you? I'm not even half full yet. I don't understand. How do you do that? Oh, it's easy. You just get out your knife and you put it to your stomach and you rip a hole in it. And that way you can eat as much as you want. Oh, it's not going to hurt. No, not much to speak of. Oh, okay, said the troll, because he didn't want to be a lesser man. And he got at his knife and he put it to his stomach and ripped a hole in it. Well, as you can imagine, that was the end of him. He rolled over onto the ground, crumbled and turned into thousands of pieces of rock and scattered all over the place. So now the Ashlad was safe. And he went inside the castle that was inside the mountain. And there he took as much gold and silver and jewelry that he could carry, for the troll had stolen it from everyone in the countryside for hundreds of years. And he brought this back to his mother and his father. And with that, they were able to pay off all of their debts and lived in the greatest of safety and comfort to the end of their days. Og snipp, snapp, snute. Her eventyret ute, which is Norwegian and means snip, snap, snout. this tale is told out. And that's how you end a story for as long as I have known it, and for a very long time. So that's a good example. The trolls are big and mean and nasty. They're out to eat you, but they can be tricked. They are not that smart at this point. Their greatest weapon is their ability to instill fear in you. And you know from your own experience that when you're frightened, you don't think very clearly. And so there's some great lessons here in how to deal with fear when it comes to how do you deal with a troll. And in this case, he just outsmarted him, because one of trolls' weaknesses, and tell the kids this, is they, if you can get them to hurt themselves, like you could say, hey, troll, there's a mosquito sitting on your forehead, you better slap it. Ah! Oh, that's the end of him. And of course, tricking them to come out when the sun is shining, very, very good thing. Another thing that works is to use a flashlight. There's a lot of ways to trick a troll. I've written a whole book about it. So, but anyway, the stories are being told, and then comes a momentous occasion. 1814, Sweden and Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, had been on opposite sides during the Napoleonic Wars, and Denmark lost. And it was decided that as war settlement, Denmark should give Norway to Sweden. We were to become Swedish territory. Denmark did that. They did get to keep Iceland and Greenland. So just so you know. But there was, things, there wasn't any email or texting, and there wasn't fax machines or quick ways of doing it. So Denmark was upset about losing Norway and said to Norway, listen, we have to give you to Sweden as a war settlement, but if you're a free country, we can't do it. So we're giving you your freedom. So Norway got this message. They lost no time. They're prepared for this. In just like a month or something, they managed to write a constitution, ratify a constitution, and declare themselves an independent country, and voted a minor Danish prince to be their new king. In fact, when they ratified the constitution, they said, evig og tro til Dovre faller, which means forever faithful until the Dovre mountain falls. And that might not mean so much to you, but into Norwegian, you will know that Dovre is a mountain that's home to the powerful troll king, whose name is Dovre. So even as they swear upon their brand new constitution, they're invoking trolls. Nothing is more eternal in Norway than the trolls. So anyway, Sweden did not like this when they came and said, okay, you're ours now. And Norway said, no, we're independent. So they went to war. And there was, Sweden was always good with that stuff, and Norway was not. So after 2 months, we caved and became Swedish territory. And that was hard. But Sweden let us keep the constitution. So in 1814, we became Sweden. And then what happens is we're traded to Sweden, and now we're Swedish. Before we were Danish. And at this time, something called the National Romantic Movement spreads over Europe. And for Norway, it's like, who are we? Who are we that's not Danish and not Swedish? And that becomes a very big question of identity. And just right after all of this, in 1845, Asbjørnsen and Moe, two collectors of Norwegian folk tales, published their first collection of Norwegian folk tales, including the troll stories. And it was like people went like, oh, this is it. This is who we are. That's so different from Sweden and from Denmark. We are, the troll stories were completely pivotal in defining Norway as a separate identity with its, it's got its otherness. It's just complete total wildness in the landscape. The landscape is so dramatic and haunting. You've got that stark contrast between light and dark that's always present in Norway. So when those folktales were published, that and especially the trolls that became, this is who we are, that's different. They became so important, these stories, that as we moved away from being Danish and Swedish, books began to be published in something more Norwegian than Danish. And every time one of those books, it was a new update in the official language, and that took that took a long time. There was still a lot more Danish in it when I was a kid than there is now. But every time there was an update, there were 3 books that were immediately reprinted. One was the Bible. The second was the official book of hymns, Landstats reviderte samebok. But the third one was Asbjørnsen and Moe's collection of Norwegian folk tales. So that tells you something about how important they were in the sense of national identity. And then to even really cement this came the illustrations by Theodor Kittelsen of the trolls. When the first illustrated version of the folk tales came out, people just went, he got it. This is an example. This is a troll. They are of the landscape. They are in the landscape. And when they die, they return to the landscape. What Norway is made up of. Norway is just made up of trolls. Here is from a story about a troll who's sitting around wondering how old he is. They get to be hundreds, maybe thousands of years old. And you can see that they grow trees and shrubs and things all over. Make sure I don't get a glare on it there. That's better. Here's a brutal one where he actually sticks a sword and does away with the troll. But they are Norway. And so they became really important. And, into all of this, also Henrik Ibsen's play, Per Gynt. Per Gynt meets with, and he develops the psychological aspect of a troll, because in that play, one of the big questions is, what is the difference between a troll and a man? And, of course, a troll doesn't have a soul. He's utterly selfish. Troll vær deg selv nok. You are enough unto yourself. So that sort of dimension of seeing trolls as actually the dark side does Per become a troll, or is he human? Does he deserve to sort of have a Christian burial, or doesn't he? This becomes a big question in that story. And then of course what from the music in the Hall of the Mountain King, which Grieg wrote for that play, and boom 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 boom. That's the arrival in the Hall of the Mountain King. That's the arrival of the trolls. If you listen to it, and the Mountain King is a troll. And so that is when Per is inside the mountain with all of the trolls and that frenzy, that craziness. So again, that part of that strong Norwegian identity, that's so much in literature and in art and in the music that was composed at that time. So it was a strong identity. And in 1905, the union with Sweden dissolved, and Norway became an independent country, once again choosing a minor Danish prince as its king, King Håkon. And trolls remained a symbol of Norway. But as you know, over time, the trolls have shrunk and they have gotten less intelligent. And a lot of people in the United States also think of the trolls as these little cute creatures. And to a certain extent, that's what they have become. Here are some examples of what you would find in a souvenir shop. If you go to Norway, they still have big noses. They're not the handsomest thing, but they're not the terrifying creatures that they used to have. Although with some of the more recent movies, we're going back. If you've seen Troll Hunter or the new movie Troll, just Trolls or Troll, I can't remember if it's a plural. The trolls as a symbol of Norway is coming, and it remains, and they are a little bit scarier again. If you think about, for adults, like we talk about trolls on the internet, and they're definitely not pleasant. It's the dark side. Kids always ask me, are you sure there aren't any trolls alive today? And I think that by and large, trolls are extinct. I think you might spot the occasional Nissa, but what you can do is you can look for trolls in the landscape. And I brought my troll's eyeball, which my son found in Lake Superior when he was 7 years old. He's now 34. That's my youngest. And he just jumped in and said, "Mom, look what I found. It's a troll's eyeball." And you can see it. There's the pupil. And so one of the things you can do is you can go and look in the landscape. You can go like along the shores of Lake Superior, and you can find, trolls' eyeballs and fingers. You can, I have a whole collection of trolls from the boundary waters that I have spotted that have died of old age. I figure they made it over there. So, and if you want to learn more about how to, more about the trolls, you can definitely this one has a lot of tips, 7 ways to trick a troll, tips for how to spot trolls in the landscape. The Hidden Folk is about the fairies, and here's Thor, and this 9 stories about trolls. So if you have any urge to read more troll stories, you should go ahead and then we can start the Q&A. I think I was going to say my absolute favorite collection of Norse mythology is this classic one by Ingrid and Edgar Perrin Dollaire, Norse Gods and Giants. I think University of Minnesota Press has reissued it, and it's the best. It's so good. I wish I had written it, but they wrote it like 50 years before I got to writing. So anyway, I think I've said I could just speak for another couple of hours, and I'm going to try not to do that, but I would love to answer some questions.
I would love to hear you talk, but maybe we have some Q&A to get to as well. And thank you so much for taking the time. So I just want to let everyone know that we are now going to open up the floor to questions. You can please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. I'll be going back and forth with Lisa and do my best to pose as many as we can. So I already have had one question. So the Q&A function is right down in the bottom of your viewing screen. I got one right here in the chat. What is the difference between trolls and Nissa?
Oh, yep, that's a very good question. That's why I need another hour. So it's a huge difference. Nissa are one of the creatures that came out from, the maggots. And they are small, fairly benign, can be a little bit tricky and pesky, but they're about the size of a 1-year-old. And they live also to be hundreds of years old. They always wear overalls and a small red cap, and they live usually on farms, and they are the protector of the farm animals. Absolutely love horses, cows, sheep, goats, also cats and dogs, anything with fur. And so in the old days, people would call them the good people, because if you had a Nissa on your farm, you were sure to prosper if you remembered to put out porridge every Thursday and not to spy on him, because if you spied on him, you would lose him, and then your farm would just but they were sort of farm, not animals, but farm protectors. And so there's some thought that they might have moved into town. There's so few farms that they live in houses where there are pets. And one of the ways you can spot whether or not you have and this is that they're nocturnal. They do all their work at night, so you never see them. And but you see evidence of very happy animals. So that's one cue. Or if you hear a lot of noises in your attic at night, because they love to dance. They're big dancers. They have dancing competitions. But the best way to tell if you have a Nissa is if you lose mittens or socks. You don't lose them always. Sometimes they take them and use them for sleeping bags for their children. But they're very, they can be, if you're not nice to them, they can be pesky, and they're very, very strong. So they can wreak havoc if you're not nice to them. So, but there's a big, huge difference. And trolls and Nissa do not get along. They're arch enemies, because Nissa are quite like humans. So I hope that I could say there's a lot of, I've explained a lot of that in that book called The Hidden Folk, because that's an important question.
There's a follow-up question that is, what is the plural form of Nissa?
Nissas with an S. N-I-S. Nissa. In Norwegian, it would be Nisser, N-I-S-S-E-R. That would be the plural. En Nissa.
Hey, thank you. I have one coming in. Are there troll stories in like the Sami culture?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting stories there. Which, that's for purposes of cultural. I mean, I can't tell those because I'm not Sami, but I have a beautiful collection of Sami folktales, and they're very other. They're very different. They're very super interesting, but there's a lot more stories of magic and things, but there's definitely trolls.
Well, thank you. I've one in the Q&A question. The most of these questions have been coming into the chat, but looking at the Q&A function, are there any trolls in the Midwest?
Well, we're in the Midwest, and maybe we should have done, because I actually have a pretty cool collection. Maybe I can send it to you, some of the really fun pictures of trolls in the landscape that I have found in the Boundary Waters, because that there's wonderful stories about trolls. They hate noise. They really dislike noise. So when Denmark and Sweden got so crowded, that's when they just walked to Norway into the mountains where it wasn't so populated. And so there are also stories that, oh gosh, even Norway. So they waded to Iceland because they're so big they could wade. And then they waded to Greenland. And sometimes they would fall in and not make it. But other times they would be out wading when the sun came up and they turned into islands. And then, from Greenland to North America is a very short way. So if they could wade to Greenland, they could wade to North America. And very quiet over here, especially in places like the Boundary Waters. And I don't know if you've ever been to Canada, to Thunder Bay, but there's a place called Sleeping Giant Peninsula. I've camped there, and you can tell you are camping on a dead troll, a dead giant, because when you see it in profile, you see that it was a troll taking a nap, and then the sun came up. And there's a lake in the middle there, and that's you can go swim. It's a troll's belly button.
I think I know where my next destination will be, swimming in a troll belly button.
Yeah. So I have seen a lot of, because I forgot to say that when they die of old age instead of sun or being tricked or something, they begin to shrink, like you saw in those pictures, and they get smaller and then covered with dirt, and they never clean, so bushes and stuff grow on it, and then they get stiff. Just like people get stiff, only even stiffer. So pretty soon they can only take a step a day, a step a week, and then it's a step a month, and a step a year, and then they totally petrify, and they look like overturned tree roots. So sometimes overturned tree root is an overturned tree root, but other times, if you look very carefully, you can see the eyes, the nose, the arms. It's actually a troll that died of old age. And we seem to have a lot of those in the Boundary Waters.
Wow, that's something to be on the lookout next time I'm up there. I have a couple more questions. I have one. Are there any polar bears or ice bears in these stories? Do ice bears ever come up?
There is a very well-known story called it's sometimes referred to as the cat in the Dovre Mountains. And is a story about a man who's bringing a polar bear to the king of Denmark. So you knew the stories were told back in the day. Though it's called, in my version, it's called The White Cat in the Dovre Mountains. And it's the polar bear that saves the day. The stupid trolls think that he's a cat. And so they try to tease him, and boy, he knows how to finish them off. So, yes.
Thank you. I have someone asking, have you ever written any books about the Nissa? We know that you wrote The 7 Ways to Trick a Troll.
Yeah, I have written this book called The Hidden Folk. And in it are stories about fairies and elves and gnomes and dwarves. And there's and selkies, and then here is a story called The Nissa's Revenge, which my grandson says is a really good story.
Going along those lines, are there any recommendations for a children's book in English about Nissas? Obviously your own, but are there any more that you would recommend?
I would recommend some of the Astrid Lindgren. There's more, these kinds of stories, there's more of in Swedish than in Norwegian. You don't get a lot of troll stories in Sweden, but you get a lot of stories, and you will probably recognize the word tomte, Tomte. A tomte is the Swedish name for a Nissa. So just different languages. And sometimes in Danish, one reason I think that Danish trolls are thought of as being small is because in certain areas of Denmark, what I would call a Nissa, they would call a troll. So it can be a translation issue that came in when they came to the United States. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to give one more final request. If there's any more Q&A or questions, if you could please type them into the chat if you have not gotten them, or in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If not, we are actually nearing the last few minutes before our... Oh, I got one. There we go. Oh, yes. So just so everyone knows, that this webinar is recorded, and then once it'll be up on YouTube after in a little while, in a short while, to make it all look nice for everyone. And then one last question: have trolls been misunderstood?
That's such a good question. Have trolls been misunderstood? I think that trolls do represent, today it is kind of the dark side. When I was a kid, if I did bad things, my parents would call me trollunge, which means you troll child. There was a clear recognition that when you let your darker nature take over, it's the troll inside you. So if you think of it as nowadays more metaphorical. In previous days, I don't think that they were misunderstood so much as we maybe misunderstood the hidden folk. But there was just this clear sense with the hidden folk that if you could live in harmony with them, which was to say to live in harmony with nature, then everything would go well. There was just always a sense that the world around you was alive in a way that I think we don't think anymore. And so in that way, we do misunderstand these creatures. It's not straight up evil. It's a question of how do you live in balance? How do you live in harmony with the natural world that's behind all of this? So I guess the answer is both yes and no.